All right, let's get started. Hey everyone, thank you for joining this morning or this afternoon or this evening, whatever time zone you're in. My name is Ethan Jones. I work on product here at WireMock, and we've got Dan Perovich here as well, who leads our customer success team, and he is going to be walking you through our new data import functionality today. So a few pieces of housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and drop them in the Q&A section in the Zoom. I will call them out as we go. If you're interested in sharing this with your team, we will send the recording out after as well, so don't worry about that. And if you have any follow-up questions, so you want to talk to us more about it, you have ideas for where we could take the feature or any other general questions about WireMock, we always love to work with our users as design partners. We are an open book, so feel free to contact either me and Dan. We will put our emails in the chat, and we can definitely do some one-on-one after this to go deeper on anything related to WireMock that you want. All right, I will hand it over to Dan to get started now, and we'll run through our new data sources capability.
Thank you, Ethan. Hello, everybody from Washington, D.C. area. Again, my name's Dan Perovich. I lead customer success and sales engineering here at WireMock Cloud. Going to spend the next probably 10 minutes showcasing the data sources feature. And just a reminder, again, use that question and answer box if it's related to data sources. And then if we have time at the tail end of today, we'll open up the question and answers for an Ask Me Anything session as well. So let me get my screen shared here and we'll start taking a look. Okay, at this point, you all should be seeing my screen. And you'll notice we've got this data sources section open here. You'll be able to find this in the left-hand navigation. So we have our typical home button, and our API templates button, and then we have this data sources section. So the first step in using data sources to actually get a data source loaded into WireMock Cloud. You can see I have several here loaded, and we'll take a look at one of these in a bit, but let's create a new one together by clicking Create New Data Source. You'll notice that today we are supporting the import of CSV files as data sources. So we'll choose a CSV file. I've got one prepared for us here. Upon clicking that, you'll notice that it's imported very quickly into WireMock Cloud. We have, in this particular example, a column of usernames and a column of response, so get user response bodies. You'll also notice that we can change the type of field each one of these is if we're interested in doing that. We're just going to use string for our demonstration today. And I'll go ahead and give this data source a name. So let's call this WireMock Live. And we'll click Save. Now our WireMock Live data source is created down below. We can click into it and notice that it's just as we saw it before, but now we also have the capability to share them as well. Much like we could share other assets in the WireMock Cloud with individual users and teams, we can do those with data sets or data sources as well. By default, the data source is scoped only to the user who creates it. So if you are sharing your mock API and want others to be able to edit it, you will also need to share the associated data source with it. So now that we have our WireMock Live data source loaded here, let's go ahead and make use of it. So I've got a mock API open here. I'll do a quick refresh on this page here. And let's create a new stub together. We'll call this stub here, get a user. And we'll change our matching criteria to user, and let's use a regular expression match here on the path. So we'll do a path regular expression here, accepting any user with a 0 to 9 digit in it. You'll notice in the request matching section, we have this new data source drop down. We can hop into this data source and go and find the data source we created together, which is our WireMock Live data source. And then we can specify a where clause. Now for our demonstration here, I'm going to specify a where clause. And I'll show you a couple other ways that we can use this in a follow-up example. So in this where clause, this is an ANSI SQL where clause. We're going to look for inside of our data source, if you remember, Our data source has the column names username and get user response. So we'll say where username is equal to, and then using our handlebar helpers, we'll pull out the second element of the request path. So therefore, that would be the user and ID number coming out in this where clause. In the response, we'll come down and check our enabled dynamic response templating. And for the body, we're going to go ahead and specify this particular handlebar helper. You'll notice that the query results from our data source lookup will come back as a data object, and then we'll look at the items. And in this case, I'm simply going to pull the very first item that's returned, as there should only be one, and then the column name that we want to reference. So I'll go ahead and I'll save this. And let's go ahead and give it a test in our test requester. Random user 9 picked for us automatically. And when I hit send, we can see that our response body being pulled from our data source column is being returned here. And if we go ahead and change this to any one of the other numbers, maybe user 4, we'll see that the user 4 comes back. And just so we can see a slightly different one, user 2, this one is different, yay. All right, so that's the basic premise of showing you how data sources are used. Let's look at a little bit more of a complex use case. I've got another data source here. This one's called users indexed. In this case, we have ID, username, user ID, first name, and last name. And we're going to walk through the various different stubs I have in this mock API that reference that data source. So we can see in our get a random user, this is just going to be a get on user. In this case, we're going to use the data source users indexed, and our where clause is actually going to pick a random ID from the lower and upper bound of those IDs that we have in our data source. Now, take notice to this checkbox here, matches stub only if data is found. We'll see how that comes into play in a couple of our other stubs here. So if we go ahead and give this a try, this is a request to slash user. Let's go ahead and hit a send on this. And we can see Renee 14 comes back. We hit it again. We've got Jamie McDonald, right? And we can see a different piece coming back each time. Now the response body is a little bit different in this example. In this case, because we're not sure if one record or multiple records will come back in all of our various stubs, we're making use of the handlebar helper each. In this case, it's going to loop through or iterate through all of the data items and define them as a row. And then we'll build out the user object and its parameters using the various different column names. So row.username, row.userid, so on and so forth. You'll also notice at the very end here, we also have this unless at last. This is going to specify that a comma belongs between each one of the user entries, except for after the very last object inside of our collection of data items. Now let's take a look at get a user. In this case, we're going to use a match on a query parameter for username. And this is a regular expression match. And like we saw a little bit before, again, we're going to say this stub only matches if this where clause returns a record. And this is the first name is equal to that username. And the response body is exactly as we saw with the get a random user as well. So in this case, when I hit the get here, we can see username and a random string has been picked for me. If I go ahead and I send this, we'll see that this record not found in the data source. We're actually hitting this stub down below, get a user, no record data source. And I'll show that in a moment. But if we pick a name that actually does exist in our data source, such as Jason, we can see that this stub of get a user with the query parameter of username is now being matched, returning the record for Jason, first name equals Jason. We'll come down to get all users. In this case, we have no where clause specified, so we would expect the entire data set to be returned. So, this should match regardless. And again, using that looping logic, that iterator over all the data items that are returned, we'll be able to get a full JSON with proper commas placed because of that unless, as I mentioned, populating the entire data source into our response body. And the last example here, as I promised, would be that, okay, what happens if we passed in a username, right, with a regular expression, but we do not actually find, a record inside of the data source that matches our where clause. In this case, this would be our fallback. We have a priority of 6. That's lower than our other ones, which was a 5. And that was the result. That gave us the result that we saw before, where if no records are found, let's go ahead and return this record not found in data source. And this is just a customized message and response code that I specified in our example here. So with that, hopefully you see the incredible value of these data sources. One of the best reasons I would say for using these is oftentimes, in the past, before data sources, we may have had to create matching logic for every one of these 20 different records so that we could match them. And the same might also go for our data source over here, where we might have to, create multiple stubs in our mock API, which, admittedly could be, more difficult to maintain. Whereas today in the data source world, we can simply maintain our data source and have a much lower number of stubs inside of our mock API that reference that data source to do the matching logic and then respond with the data elements that we want, whether that's an entire payload or that is using individual pieces of information from the data source to build our payload dynamically. With that, Ethan, I'll ask you, do we have any questions queued up based on what we've covered today?
Yeah, we've got a couple here. You touched on this briefly. You said we support CSV import today. What are the plans for other data sources in the future?
Great question. Yeah, so we actually have on our roadmap support to connect our data source feature to any ANSI SQL database. So this is something that we are currently tracking and working on. And if that's of interest to anyone, I'd urge them to reach out so we can take them on a little bit deeper dive into what that future looks like. In addition to our already existing CSV feature, which is available to everybody, but the future capabilities of attaching to any ANSI SQL database.
Awesome. And we do have a couple more questions, but just for everyone watching, we've got a little bit of time left. So if you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. They don't have to be about data import. We're happy to chat anything WireMock while we're here, since this is just WireMock Live in general. Another question we've got here is what kind of limitations are on here in terms of data size or how many rows or things like that?
Okay, good question. Let me go ahead and get back over into our data sources list here as my internet flakes out on me. There we go. All right, so there are 3 different limits that are in place today on data sources. So one is the number of data sources you can have in an account, a WireMock cloud account. So as you can see that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them in my account here. Today for non-enterprise users, so that would be users on a trial, users on a personal account, or some of the legacy accounts, that would be a limit of 3 data sources would be available. And then at the enterprise level, there's a larger number of data sources that are available at the enterprise level. Now, inside of a data source, there are 2 more potential limits that we could bump into. The data source rows per data source. So how many rows or records can we have in these? Again, at the personal level, that would be 100 rows per data source. At the trial level, that's 1,000, and then at the enterprise subscription level, that's 10,000 today. And at the enterprise subscription level, if that is a concern, please definitely reach out to us. These are soft limits, and we can work with on a case-by-case basis to understand the needs and be flexible on that for our enterprise customers. And then the last limit on there is the size per row. So how many bytes per row are we storing in these pieces, right? Because ultimately you could store a MIME type right in here, right? A base 64 encoded string in here that could result in a PDF or an image file. So there are limitations on here. On the personal level, we're talking about 10 kilobytes, which is quite generous. At the enterprise trial level, we're at 10 kilobytes, and then at the enterprise level, we've got 1 megabyte. And remember, this is text, so 1 megabyte of pure text per line is rather large. But again, if we are bumping into that level, please reach out and let's have a conversation to understand your needs.
Another question we've got is, are these data sources specific to individual mock APIs, or can I use them across multiple mock APIs?
You can use them across multiple mock APIs, absolutely. So it's a one data source to many mock API relationship. And then also, I'll just urge to remember that if you are sharing your mock APIs that are referencing data sources, it is best practice and recommended that you also share the data source referenced by that mock API with the same audience.
That's a good question. Who has access to the data sources? Where does that kind of fit into the, let's call it the RBAC or the permission model of the system?
Yeah, sure. So when a data source is created, it is only available to the user that's created. Of course, the super admin on the account would be able to see all of the data sources as they should, to understand who owns them and manage them in the case of user departures and such. But again, by default, when a data source is created, it's owned by the user and only available to that user until they use the share button. After saving that data source, coming back into it, they can then go ahead and share that with an individual user, such as my colleague Rob, giving Rob access to edit the data source, be an admin to change the sharing rights on it, or read only to be able to see this data source and actually use it in any mock APIs that reference it. And the same goes for team membership. So we can share these with teams. And if you all recall, a team is just a collection of multiple users that is defined up in the organization and users section of WireMock Cloud.
One last question, unless anybody pops in with anything else here in the next couple of minutes, which feel free. And I apologize, Dan, if this one's a little trickier to do on the spot, but what happens if something goes wrong? Like I'm referencing a data source and it gets deleted because someone doesn't know it's in use. Just kind of what kind of experience should I expect there?
Yeah, great question. I actually did look at this one earlier today. So let's go ahead and go over to our data sources here. We have our WireMock Live. I'm going to go ahead and delete WireMock Live, and I will confirm that. And if we come back into our mock, and I'm going to reload our mock here, we can see in the stub that actually referenced the data source, we can see the data source that this stub was referencing no longer exists, and that our data source field has now been blanked out. So at this point, in order for this to work again, we'll also notice the data source icon reference up here has been tagged as red instead of black. That we'll need to specify a new data source or to remove the data source matching criteria entirely using our trash can icon here. Hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Seems simple enough to recover from.
Great.
Okay, it looks like that's all the questions we have. As a reminder for everyone, this is WireMock Live, so we're going to be doing this pretty much monthly, covering a different topic related to WireMock, sometimes new features, sometimes going deep on existing functionality. Once again, we will send this out as a recording as well. My email is ethan@wiremock.io, Dan's is dan@wiremock.io, or you can submit the form on our website. We are happy to chat if you had any follow-up questions about anything you saw today. With that, unless you had something else, Dan, I hope everyone has
Nope.
a great rest of their day. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, everyone.